Hello, everyone. I'm John Dickerson in New York. CBS News has confirmed former President Donald Trump has been indicted by federal prosecutors over his handling of classified documents. It is a multi-count indictment involving the retention of national defense information and obstruction. The case centers on repeated efforts by the National Archives to retrieve documents from the former president, a case that came to a head in August when the FBI searched his Florida estate and found more documents. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane joins me now. Scott, what do we know? Do we have it? What details do we have on the charges? What could they be?
Well, there's multiple charges according to CBS News, and I got to tell you, some of this may be a floor, not a ceiling. According to the sources we have and the reporting we have, this would include unlawful retention of national defense information and potentially obstruction. But again, that may be the floor, not the ceiling, as this court date approaches Tuesday in the Southern District of Florida. That's a courthouse in Miami. That's the same district in which Mar-a-Lago exists, in the Southern District of Florida. The grand jury has been in Florida at the courthouse in recent days, with witnesses coming through in recent days. We didn't know about that Florida grand jury until just the past few days, knowing there was full well a grand jury convening and hearing witnesses here in the District of Columbia. It's a multi-count indictment, but the question we're trying to answer as Tuesday approaches is, how many is multi? How many charges does the former president face?
That's right. Okay. Scott MacFarlane in Washington. Thank you, Scott. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins me now. Jessica, what charges could they be based on what was being investigated? I should, before I let you answer that, the special counsel has not commented, but CBS News has confirmed there are multiple counts. What are your thoughts about what the charges could be?
So I think we're looking at a violation of obstruction of justice. Obviously, there's a provision of the federal penal code that talks about that. And also, it sounds like, based on Scott's reporting, we're also looking at part of the Espionage Act that we've been talking about since that search warrant in the Mar-a-Lago case was unsealed. And they cited 3 different federal statutes. One of them was an obstruction of justice statute. One of them was part of the so-called Espionage Act, and the reporting, frankly, very neatly fits within both of those federal statutes. Now, you and I have discussed why this could amount to obstruction of justice, and it essentially, in a sentence, is because federal law enforcement officers asked the former president over and over again for these documents. He didn't turn them over, and there was an ongoing investigation. Where does the Espionage Act kick in? Because even if you originally lawfully have certain government documents, you can't retain those documents under certain circumstances and or disseminate those documents under certain circumstances. So one of the things, John, I'm really looking for is, do they focus on retention or dissemination when it comes to these charges? Sorry.
Yes, no, absolutely. That distinction within the Espionage Act, which would go to his behavior. Is there any danger for someone in the position that the former president is in to go ahead of prosecutors, to announce this, to launch what the president has put out several comments on his social media platform about this? What's the danger in that?
So, I mean, certainly, I think any of his lawyers must just be beside themselves at this point. There is a client control issue, to say the least. There's really not much legally that could potentially help him by saying this is going to happen. I mean, all of this is political. All of this is so that he can frame the narrative. We can hear it from him first, and his supporters will continue to be told this is a witch hunt. This is all the political weaponization of the Department of Justice. I think getting out in front of this is all about politics.
Jessica, one more question I want to ask you, which is that according to Bob Costa's reporting, the Trump legal team is going to raise questions of prosecutorial abuse. And one of the things they're going to talk about is Evan Corcoran, who was a former lawyer for the president, who a judge ruled had to turn over materials from his representation with former President Trump because he applied what's called the crime fraud exemption of attorney-client privilege. Can you explain that, if it's possible, briefly, just to give us a sense of of this relationship between this case and this lawyer who was working for Donald Trump?
So very briefly, I think viewers know there's something called the attorney-client privilege, and it protects many communications that people have with their attorneys because we want them to have free and open discussions. But there's an exception to that. One of the exceptions is you don't get to plan a crime or engage in a fraud with your attorney and then have that attorney and client say, sorry, law enforcement, you don't get to obtain any of this information because it's protected by the attorney-client privilege. If you think about the policy behind the attorney-client privilege, it's completely undermined if we allowed people to use it to commit crimes or frauds. And that's how you get evidence from the former president's attorney. And I think that they will argue that it was incorrect to say that the crime fraud exception applied.
But a judge doesn't do that willy-nilly. I mean, a judge has to be presented with enough to decide to engage that crime fraud exemption.
Exactly. And it is a high threshold. And let's remember that judges are former attorneys. And if there's one thing that attorneys really hold dear and think is quite serious, it is the attorney-client privilege. It's not something that you take lightly at all. And again, it is the rare case where the crime fraud exception exists, and is the rare case where a federal judge says that I think this is a situation where it has arisen, so much so that we can ask this attorney for information that we otherwise would not be able to obtain.
Jessica, before I let you go, what else should we be thinking about here, either on this question of the Trump legal team, according to Bob Costa's reporting, is going to basically go after the way in which this investigation was done? Is there a test we should be looking for in terms of the validity of that argument, or anything else, while details are in the infant stages here, that you would be looking for as the details come in?
So obviously the specifics of the charges, whether or not the indictment lays out any factual specifics, or if the indictment is really just bare bones. In terms of the former president's allegations that essentially this is a political witch hunt, I would just say that is what he has argued with respect to every investigation that involves him. So what will we look to see if there's any there? If they file motions in court and if a judge grants those motions. But short of that, it's very different what you hear outside the courtroom versus what you hear inside the courtroom.
Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for helping us get a handle of this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe joins me now on the phone. Ed, how does, being a former president, being a case based on the actions only a person in his position can do, change the case from what we're used to in criminal trials, where, I mean, this is all brand new territory here for a federal indictment of a former president?
It sure is, John, and it's notable that he announced this, as you've been pointing out, he announced this himself on a social media platform that he established, and then just minutes later, his campaign sent out a fundraising email telling his followers, telling those that have been donating sums of money to his election campaign that he was indicted, and asking them to donate again to keep that campaign going. This is uncharted territory, of course, and something very different for American politics and even for the American legal system, because you've never had somebody quite like this face this kind of indictment from federal prosecutors. And so we wait to see here in the coming hours how other candidates in the Republican contest react. I can tell you over at the White House, they have no official comment tonight. They've referred us to the Justice Department. The Justice Department, of course, has referred us to the Special Counsel's Office, which our colleagues say has no comment tonight. The president was asked about this. This is sort of about the, concern that there may be people now in the country anticipating this indictment, and what he would say to convince skeptics that they should trust the independence and fairness of the Justice Department that Trump continues to attack. The president, in a news conference alongside the British Prime Minister, said, quote, "I have never once, not one single time, suggested to the Justice Department what they should do or not do relative to bringing a charge or not bringing a charge," he said, as his temper kind of got the best of him. In other words, trying to say to people, unlike my predecessor, who dabbled and tried to interfere in Justice Department activities, he has not done so, both because of the criminal cases the investigations surrounding the former president, but also the one surrounding his own son, which continues as well with a federal prosecutor out of Delaware. So in other words, saying, I have not meddled, I don't intend to meddle, and I can tell you based on our reporting at the White House that they do great work to try to wall off the White House from the Justice Department when it comes to these matters. Every other time there's been some other development in the Trump cases, when you ask the White House, did you get any heads up? They said, we learned about it the way you did on the news, or through you guys. We did not get any kind of formal heads up, and that's by design.
And they are trying to maintain a line, which is what really this case is all about. What are the lines of the law, and do they apply to all Americans equally, even to former presidents? Ed, you've been out in Iowa. You've been covering Republican presidential candidates. Former President Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. He is the far and away frontrunner in that race. Given what you're reporting and what you've seen, what's your sense of how this is received in the political world? Because obviously the president announcing this on social media first is taking advantage of his political support and rallying them for his legal case.
And he's doing that because he remembers that when he was indicted in Manhattan, his numbers went up. And I think his opponents remember that as well, that the support, if anything, is just solidified and may have grown depending on how Republican voters were being surveyed. So we'll see here in the coming days how Iowa Republicans, New Hampshire Republicans, South Carolina Republicans, so we'll get the first crack at this, respond to this, and then how the party does overall nationally. And you've seen most of his opponents say, look, if he wasn't the guy who had been president and was running again, the Justice Department might not be doing this to him. In other words, saying he's being targeted because he's a Republican president and this is a Democratic administration. But I can tell you, John, if you continue to look at those numbers that suggest maybe 35, 40, 45% support for him, and it's not getting beyond that, the other candidates know, if you do the math, that there's a universe out there that he can be beat if you can clear the field and keep it to just fewer candidates. And we talk to voters who say, look, I appreciate what he did. If it's ultimately him versus President Biden, I'll do it if I have to. But there are other options out there. I'd like to hear from them because this other guy, as one voter put it to me, has just a lot of stuff. Trump, his baggage, in other words. And if there's somebody else who can do this and not come with all the legal and personal baggage of the former president, then at least that voter and many others we have heard from and we suspect are out there and the campaigns believe are out there, may ultimately opt to go with somebody else. But it's just too soon to say here, knowing that there will be various ways that this news is consumed and absorbed by people across the country tonight. And then we'll see how his opponents react. Some of them are set to be on television tonight or tomorrow, or will be campaigning tomorrow, making appearances across the country. And we'll see how, if at all, they discuss this and either express support for him or suggest that the legal process should continue to play out. This is uncharted territory like we've never seen before, both within the Republican Party and then, of course, for Democrats sitting there waiting to see what that party ultimately decides to do ahead of next year's election.
And just to remind those who are perhaps just tuning in, a multiple count indictment CBS News has confirmed of retention of national defense documents and also obstruction of justice. Ed, it occurs to me the president will appear in Miami at a federal courthouse on Tuesday at 3 p.m., according to the former president, but we've confirmed that it'll be Tuesday. This is going to draw out unless the president reaches a deal, which Bob Costa suggests there's not any small, even sliver of a chance that he will, that the former president will fight this with everything that he can, but that this will roll out through the primaries, during all the debates, perhaps into the general election.
Well, we know already that at least the Manhattan case is scheduled to roll out through the general election, and at least or towards the end of the primary season next March, when he is slated to appear in a Manhattan courtroom to face those charges related to business practices primarily there in New York. Who knows what the schedule will be like in terms of the federal case. And we still, of course, are awaiting word of a potential indictment in Georgia with the election interference charges that are believed to be the focus of the investigation there. So, yes, we very well may see the frontrunner for the Republican Party nomination sitting in courtrooms in Atlanta or New York or Washington or Miami, or shuttling between all of them while still somehow maintaining a campaign for president. And that is where I wonder at what point does the party tolerate that? Do voters tolerate that? If there are other opponents out there who aren't in courtrooms but are instead in the VFW halls and the church basements and the living rooms of voters in those early primary states, eager to hear what they have to say.
Ed, I wonder if you have any thoughts about whether the nature of these charges, as we understand them, change what has been a pretty familiar pattern in the age of Donald Trump, which is to say there are accusations sometimes made in the press, sometimes made by officials, and there's a rallying around the president. What's different in this case is that these are documents that are so sensitive in the handling of them, perhaps during this trial, they might have to go into special accommodations because some of this information, as we understand from our reporting, is as sensitive as it gets, which leads us to national security, which leads us to sensitivities. And I wonder, this is where the question comes, whether you think as a political matter, the fact that these are national security documents, these are secrets, perhaps the most valuable of the United States, that might change the political reaction, particularly from members of Congress who are stewards of those same secrets, the leaders of Congress who get to see these secrets in the president's own party, whether that will perhaps change the traditional political rallying behind the former president.
Perhaps, but let's remember we're still awaiting resolution of the Justice Department investigation into the sitting president's handling of this kind of information at his home and at his former office when he was a former vice president. So that, because remember, in the wake of the two investigations beginning earlier this year, you had members of both parties up on Capitol Hill saying, well, this just clearly shows us that there's a systemic institutional issue with classification of documents. And so unless they can prove in court or start to allege that something he was in possession of caused other things to happen in the national security realm, there may very well be Republicans who say, okay, yeah, but the other guy was doing it too. And so did former Vice President Mike Pence, who was just cleared by the Justice Department last week. So it may be less a partisan or concern about Trump issue. It may just revive the belief that Democrats and Republicans had on both sides that there are systemic concerns with how anyone gets to handle this information. And I think absent details of the result of him having that information and what risks there might have been, that would continue to be the argument that both sides would make. We'll see.
We'll see. And is it your understanding? You mentioned that the White House, they're not going to be commenting on this at all. The president affirmed that in his comments at a press conference on Thursday. What's your sense of the rest of the Democratic Party and the pressures that some of them might feel or opportunities they might see to engage in the political side of this process, which is partially what the former president would like, given his past practice of baiting his opponents?
Yeah, and I think that'll be a real test, is how does the Democratic Party, at least writ large, respond to this? Look, they've been making the argument he's dangerous to democracy, he's dangerous to the rule of law, that Republicans continue to support him and other people who denied reality about the 2020 elections. If they so choose, they'll continue to lose elections. So, yes, watching the fringes of the party or those that are more outspoken react to this in the coming days and how that could blow back on Democrats certainly remains to be seen. I would think that there are some more senior leaders or those involved in the campaign who would urge restraint and silence, in essence, and allow this to play out and allow Republicans to be left to have to respond to this on the campaign trail and on Capitol Hill and in other ways as this plays out next week. The president is set to go tomorrow, the current president, to North Carolina with his wife for two different events. North Carolina is a state that the White House believes the president can win for Democrats again, the first time since 2008. And he'll be focused on some economic and military issues in a state where both of those topics are top of mind, believing that having only lost by a few points in 2020, it's gettable for them next year. And, conceivably, with that state's mix of centrists and independents, if this keeps up and if the Republican Party doesn't react the way voters in that state want, that's where I think Democrats think they might have a chance. And that will be the goal throughout the rest of this year. Keep the president being president, meeting with world leaders, greeting the troops, talking about the economy and all the things he had done over the last 2 years to potentially set the economy in a great shape going forward. and stay out of this stuff, the legal problems facing his predecessor, as long as possible, in hopes that voters see him as a serious option and worthy of reelection.
And that North Carolina event will be one to watch with the former president, the former vice president, and I think also the current sitting governor, Ron DeSantis of Florida. Ed O'Keefe, thank you. We're going to go to Scott MacFarlane, who has some for us in Washington, who has CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, who has some new information. Scott, what can you tell us?
Now, CBS News confirms it will be an arraignment proceeding Tuesday afternoon in the Southern District of Florida. When you go for arraignment in the federal court system, they read you the charges. They give you a chance to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. And typically, John, they set bond conditions for a defendant, a criminal defendant, at an arraignment. It will be fascinating and potentially provocative to find out what bond conditions are ordered and agreed upon for a former president of the United States. In the Southern District of Florida, they refer to the assignment of cases to blind random selection, which is true for other federal courts in America as well. They will truly pick a name out of a computer-generated system to assign the district court judge for this case. Now, he may appear before a magistrate judge, a lower-level judge who handles just initial proceedings Tuesday, but ultimately this case moves to a federal court judge, a district court judge, some of whom in Florida, some of whom in Miami, have been appointed by then-President Trump, which opens up a whole nother kettle of fish. We had one House Judiciary Committee member today, Glenn Ivey, Democrat from Maryland, former federal prosecutor, who told CBS News, if this case is assigned to a Trump-appointed judge, that judge should seriously consider recusal based on the unprecedented and unique political dynamic at play there. But the arraignment is Tuesday afternoon at the federal courthouse in Miami. Now, we have seen Donald Trump arraigned quite recently in Manhattan in that local prosecution from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. And when that happened, there was this intense and large in scope security protocol and restriction put in place near the courthouse to get Donald Trump into the courthouse safely, to keep all those who'd gathered there safe. Presumably, the same thing's going to have to happen in Miami, where they cordon off part of that city, that vibrant, busy city, to get a former president into a pre-announced place at a pre-announced time. Many federal courthouses in America have openings, entrances that are not publicly accessible or publicly viewable. That's how inmates who are in jail before court cases go into court. They don't walk through the front door. They're detained by marshals, and they're driven into a private entrance. Presumably, a former president could make use of a private entrance, and we know that because when Mike Pence recently appeared in the D.C. federal court to speak to the grand jury there, he was ushered in a private, secret entrance, not viewable to the public. Wouldn't be surprising, John, to see the same thing happen Tuesday afternoon in Florida.
Scott MacFarlane in Washington. Thank you so much, Scott.